Welcome back to Vintage Camera Digest. Today I've got a short tutorial on using zone focusing. So I hope you'll stick around to learn more about this useful skill that just seems to have faded away. Before we get started, I'd like to bring your attention to this episode's featured photo. It comes from Ron Scow and is a photo of the Mission San Javier del Bac near Tucson, Arizona. Ron used T-Max 100 and a Hasselblad SWC to capture it. I like how my eye is drawn into the photo passing through the gates, and I like this rather ragged tree breaking up the super smooth tones of the sky. So Ron, thanks for sending this in. If you have a shot that you think would look good in this spot, send me an email at the address below, and I'll take care of the rest. Now, in the last episode, we looked at the tiny Raleigh 35 series of cameras, and one reason they were able to be made so small was that there wasn't a pentaprism, like an SLR would require, or a coupled rangefinder to assist in focusing. Nope, the Raleigh 35s are viewfinder cameras that rely on zone focusing, and if you're like me, you might be put off a bit by that, not being able to achieve focus visually. But after using the camera and being pleasantly surprised at the results, I can appreciate the lost skill of zone focusing. And why do I say it's a lost skill? Well, I say that because a lot of camera companies and lens manufacturers don't give us the tools we need to do it anymore. Zone focusing requires lenses that have distance and depth of field scales, and those are things that we're seeing less and less of on newer lenses. But if you're shooting with vintage glass, you almost always find those. And if you've ever picked up an old lens, looked at all those numbers and such, and wondered what the heck all that was for, well, wonder no more. Most times when we're using our cameras, we're concerned with focusing at one point, at one distance. Whether it's an autofocus or manual focus camera, we usually use one of those focusing points or focusing aids to achieve sharp focus at one specific distance. I mean, when I'm out shooting, that's how my brain works, always has. But we also know that we can manipulate depth of field to include some area in front of and behind that specific focal point that will give us a zone where everything is acceptably sharp. And when we use zone focusing, we're using that area or zone instead of the usual point focus to ensure that our subject is sharp. Basically, our subject can be anywhere in that zone and be rendered sharp. We're leveraging depth of field to our advantage, which we probably should be doing anyway. Besides there being cameras that require this method of focusing, there are certain types of photography where it can come in handy. One I can think of right off the top of my head is street photography. It's easier to catch candid subjects in a zone than at a single focal point. It's faster and really improves your odds of getting a great shot. So, how do we do it? Well, first we'll need to be using a lens that has both distance and depth of field scale. Secondly, this is going to work better on a prime lens. Zooms can also have distance and depth of field scales, but since apparent depth of field changes at different focal lengths, it just gets exponentially more difficult to pull it off. And I rarely see a zoom lens with a depth of field scale that actually looks usable. Thirdly, this is going to work best on normal to wide angle lenses. The wider the lens, the deeper the zones can be. But as we saw with the Raleigh 35 with its 40mm lens, it can also work with normal range lenses too. And the example graphic that you'll see here is based off of an actual 50mm lens, specifically the Minolta MD50 1.7. So let's take a look and get our bearings. There are three sections of the lens we'll need to pay attention to. The distance scale, which is printed on the focusing ring with markings in both feet and meters, the depth of field scale, which doesn't move, and the aperture control ring, which we can change to whatever f-stop we want. In this first example, let's set it to f8. The center line in the depth of field scale is also lined up with the distance of 7 feet, or just beyond 2 meters. Notice that on the depth of field scale, the f-stops are marked on both sides of that center line. So let's find f8 on both sides. If we look at the distances aligned with f8 on both sides, we'll find our zone of focus. In this case, about 6 to 9 feet, or about 1.75 meters to 2.75 meters. There's always a little bit of guesswork since they can't put every number on the distance scale, But if our subject falls anywhere within this 3 foot or 1 meter zone, it will be rendered sharp, even though the actual focal distance is 7 feet or about 2 meters. For the second example, let's see what happens if we leave the focus point the same at 7 feet, but choose f22 instead of f8. Now, if we look at the distances aligned with the f22 mark on both sides of the depth of field scale, we see that a zone from about 3 feet to 15 feet, or 1.3 meters to about 5 meters, is our zone of focus. So again, if our subject falls anywhere in that range, it will be rendered sharp, even though the actual focal distance is 7 feet, or about 2 meters. Pretty cool, huh? Now what happens if we set the aperture to f4? Well, by checking the distances aligned with the f4 marks on the depth of field scale, we can see that our zone has gotten a lot smaller. And this is exactly what we'd expect, since f4 has a much shallower depth of field than f22. But the zone is about 6 feet to 9 feet, or just below 2 meters to just over 2 meters. It's a much smaller zone. Now, your zone of focus is going to be greatly influenced by the focal distance. In those last examples, the point of focus was at 7 feet. But what happens when we set the focus closer, like at 3 feet or 0.9 meters? Well, let's set the aperture back to f8 and look at the depth of field scale now. Checking with the distances aligned with the f8s on the depth of field scale, it looks like our zone of focus is from about 2 3/4 feet to 3 1/4 feet, or about 0.85 meters to 1 meter. So that zone where our subject is rendered sharp is less than 1 foot, or 1.5 meters deep. If we set the aperture to f22 at this focal distance, the zone now grows to 2.5 feet to about 3.8 feet, or about 3/4 of a meter to about 1 1/4 meters. It's definitely a deeper zone, but nowhere as deep as it was when the lens was focused at 7 feet, or about 2 meters. So now let's try one where we focused at a further distance than 7 feet. So for this example, let's set the focus to 15 feet, or about 5 meters. If we set the aperture to f8 and check the distances that align with the f8 marks on the depth of field scale, we see we now have a zone of focus from 10 feet to about 30 feet, or 3 meters to about 9 meters. So our zone of focus now is as deep as 20 feet, or about 6 meters. Now what if we choose f22 now? Well, our zone would stretch from just under 7 feet, or 2 meters, to past the infinity mark. So with a lens focused at 15 feet, our zone stretches from 7 feet, or about 2 meters, to infinity. Well, it stretches past infinity, really, and infinity is actually as far as we need to be concerned with. You might say that depth of field that extends beyond infinity is wasted depth of field. So let's modify this just a bit. I'm going to set the infinity mark to correspond with the f22 mark on the depth of field scale. That changes our actual focal distance to just over 10 feet, or about 3.5 meters. But look what it does to our zone. It now stretches from about 6 feet, or 1.8 meters, all the way to infinity. Now, when we start talking about bringing infinity into the equation, we're touching on the topic of hyperfocal focusing, which can be more complex and nuanced and is extremely useful in landscape photography. But there are people who know a lot more about that than me, so I'm not going there because I don't want to lead anyone astray. But all those numbers printed on the lenses may have looked daunting before, but now you understand how to use them, and it's not rocket science. The one skill it might be helpful to practice is judging distance, but other than that, this stuff is pretty easy. The only drawback to using this method is that every time you buy a new lens that doesn't have a distance scale or depth of field scale, you're going to feel like you're being ripped off. And in a way, we kind of are. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this quick tutorial. If so, be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. We get into all sorts of film photography stuff here, and occasionally, like this video, just good general photography how-to. So if you're new to the channel, take some time to browse through some of the previous episodes. I also enjoy all the comments, so feel free to chime in with questions, observations, or even corrections. That's how we all learn. Thanks again to Ron for this great shot, and I will see you next time.